So today we're installing a Purkeys Invert pure sine wave 2000 watt inverter in a Peterbilt truck. First thing you want to do is you really want to determine where you're going to mount this inverter. So we picked a location to mount the inverter. Now you want to, that's going to determine where your cable is going to be routed. And you have this cable pass-through plate that allow you to pass these cables through the cab or the floor inside this cab or underneath this bunk. So we're going to use a 3.5-inch hole saw and drill a hole so we can pass these cables through and mount this plate to the floor. Move my inverter back just a little bit just so it's out of the way. You also want to kind of look underneath and make sure before you drill that you're not going to hit anything, do any kind of damage to the vehicle. So it's pretty clear underneath, pretty safe to go ahead and drill a hole. I'm not going to interfere with any cross members or anything, so I'm good to move forward. So now I have my my mounting hole in there. I'm gonna get my cable situated. Again, it's a pretty short distance over to my inverter, so I'm not gonna leave a whole lot out. And I'm gonna pass these cables through. And I know my positive connection's on the left side, my negative's on the right side, so I'm going to situate my cables in that manner so it's easier to connect to my inverter, and cosmetically it looks good that way. Next step will be taking hex tech screws and securing that pass-through plate to the floor. So now I'm going to take a 5/16 bit, my drill, and these 5/16 hex tech screws, and mount that plate to the floor. And you just want to line it up so all the holes are over an edge and not you can't see any light showing through those holes. So now we're ready to mount the inverter. So just kind of line up the inverter where you want before you start drilling holes. So you want to use a 1/4-inch drill bit to go ahead and pre-drill your holes for your mounting bolts. Again, you want to ensure that you're not interfering with any kind of cross members or anything. Plus, it'll allow you to make sure you're able to easily access your mounting hardware from underneath. And it may be easier to access the back side of that inverter from inside the cab. We kind of pre-drilled or marked the holes, so it'll be easier to just remove the inverter at this point and be able to drill those holes without anything interfering. Now we're ready to mount the inverter. Take our 1/4 20 mounting bolts, run them through the pre-drilled holes, and I'm going to put the hardware on the underneath side of those bolts. So now I'm going to tighten the hardware. Sometimes it may take more than one hand. By using a 7/16 socket and wrench. I can tighten this hardware down. So first generation of this, the Purkeys inverter came with rubber boots. This newer style is now a plastic shroud. So now you're ready to put your cable boots over the positive and negative input cables. Just simply pull a little bit of the cable out just so you can easily access it. Then just run your boot up over the cable, and this will provide some added protection for those cable lugs. Now you want to run your bolt. Again, you want the bolt flat washer, and then hold your cable lug up to the input post on the positive side. Run your bolt through, and take the supplied lock washer nut, and then same thing for the negative side. Bolt, flat washer, run that through the cable lug and the input negative post. And insert the lock washer first, and then nut on the bottom of that. Then you can take a 9/16 wrench and tighten your connections. Now we're going to go ahead and connect our cables, our positive cable, negative cable, and our chassis ground. I'm going to remove my hardware from my inverter input posts. You just want that bolt and the flat washer, and then pass the bolt through the negative input post. Do the same thing on the positive cable. So next step would be to install these plastic shrouds over the cable lugs and cables to protect those connections. So I'm going to do that. You have this little plastic lip or plastic flap that'll kind of, once you get the slide the plastic shroud over the connections, you can close this up and secure that connection. Next step is my chassis ground connection. So I'm going to pull my chassis ground wire up, just give me a little bit of slack. My chassis ground location on the inverter is right here on the bottom right corner. So I'm going to remove the hardware, install my chassis ground. tighten that connection. So now we have the inverter chassis ground connected. Chassis ground is important just to protect the inverter from any faults, fault currents. I think we're ready to move on to the next step, which will be mount the controller. So I'm going to plug the inverter remote into the remote port on the inverter. Then I'm going to kind of route the cable, the remote cable, over to the outside edge of the truck. Just kind of keep all the wire, from any pinch points or anything. And then I'm going to route this cable up through here. And kind of leave some slack just to determine where I'm going to mount this controller or remote. Then I'm going to go ahead and shut or bring the bunk down so I can get a good idea where to put this remote. All right, so there's a couple different ways you can mount this remote. You have a holster for the remote that has 3 mounting holes, and we supply mounting screws in the kit. You can do it that way, or if you prefer not to have drill any type of holes in your vehicle, we have Velcro as well. So with this setup, we're going to use Velcro. So we're going to go ahead and holster this back in here. And we're going to go ahead and get our Velcro placed on the back of this remote holder. Somewhere right there in the center of the holster. And then you can simply place the opposite end on the Velcro, peel off the adhesive backing, and then put your controller in the desired location. And we're going to go right about here. And just kind of press firmly, just make sure it's properly adheres to the plastic. And that'll give you the ability to remove the controller, and the holster stays adhered to the truck. So now we want to lift the bunk back up and just kind of get all the cables nice and neat. So we're going to take up any excess cable and just kind of pull it back down into the, below the bunk compartment. And just kind of tuck our wires into the side here. So now that we got our remote cable routed down into the bunk, we're just going to kind of clean things up and just kind of all this excess we're just going to roll up and zip tie and just place that next to the inverter. So that's it. Now we're ready to connect our DC input cables to the truck batteries. So the next step I'm going to take on this inverter install is I'm going to protect these cables by inserting this conduit. We got red and black conduit that we can use to slide over these input cables. Just give that added protection to the cables. So we're going to cut any of that excess conduit off. And just secure that with a zip tie. Now we're going to do the same thing, but on the positive cable. And we're going to use the red conduit this time. Now that you have the cables out of there and secured to the inverter, you want to make sure and tighten down the dome nuts, the strain reliefs that are holding those cables through that pass-through. So we're just simply turn those dome nuts clockwise. You may have to hold it from the bottom side to keep it secured. So now we're ready to start routing the cables to the battery compartment. So now we're going to determine how to route these cables, or what's the best method to route these cables to. And I'm thinking for this setup, we'll use our clamp and hex tech screw and mount it to this cross member. So we'll get this one started. There we got one clamp. So we're going to take another clamp and go to another cross member, just give some added support for these pretty heavy cables. So I'm just going to mount the chassis ground. I've routed it through one of these clamps, and I'm going to go over to this far cross member. Go ahead and secure it to that cross member. That'll give us a good chassis ground. Just kind of either push up the slack inside the cab or secure it somewhere underneath the trailer. Just make sure it's not hanging down too low and get snagged on something. So that's how you install the chassis ground. So now we've secured the large input cables underneath the truck. Now we've routed them down to the battery box through an access hole towards the back of the box. So now we're going to pull them on through. And just make sure we take up any slack as possible. A couple things to note on making your battery connections. The inverter has a built-in capacitors. So when you're connecting to your batteries, you may see a spark. One thing you want to try to avoid is connecting your negative cable to the positive side and positive to the negative side. Reverse polarity. You could do damage to the inverter, so try to avoid that. But the first thing we want to do is install what's called a fuse cube. This is an inline fuse. It's a 200 amps. We're using a 2,000 watt inverter. This is a 200 amp fuse cube. The beauty of this type of fuse is most fuses have a good 6 inches right before the fuse that's connected to the battery. then the fuse, and the rest of the circuit. This is connected right at the battery. The cable connects right to the top of the fuse cube, so the whole circuit is protected. So we're going to go just slide that on here. You have a metal surface on the bottom of that fuse and a metal surface on top. Then you have your metal bracket, your stainless steel metal bracket. You slide that fuse cube on, slide your cable over, and then you have an insulated nut that tightens down over top of that. So we'll take our wrench and get that and tighten that down. This will be a 7/16 socket that we're using. Just make sure that's good and snug. Then you can go ahead and place that this rubber boot. Fits right over the top of that insulated nut. Just gives some added protection for that connection. So now that we have our 200 amp fuse cube installed, we're going to connect it to the positive post on this battery. Again, there's that initial spark. Again, don't be alarmed, that's just the capacitors built into the inverter. You want to make sure that, that the element inside that fuse is facing outwards. If something were to happen to the inverter, there's a dead short anywhere and blew this fuse, if you have it facing away from you, it's kind of hard to tell if the fuse is blown. So tighten that down. So now we're going to move on to the negative cable. And again, you want to go when you're you want to go across the bank when you're taking energy out or putting energy back into a battery. We have three batteries in this pack, so we're going to go to this last battery, totally opposite of the positive cable, and take our negative battery nut off and place our negative cable on this last battery. Most of our inverter harnesses are custom built to length, so you shouldn't have a whole lot of excess cable. But if you do, just make sure everything's secure. It's not going to snag on anything. It just cosmetically looks good inside the battery box. So we've successfully installed the inverter, mounted the controller, routed the cables to the battery box. Connected the cables, the DC input cables. So now we're ready to test the inverter. So now we're going to quickly do just a quick test to make sure the inverter comes on. So we're going to grab the controller here and just simply hit the on. There's an on-off button, just touch sensitive on-off button. And we're just going to simply make sure we have LEDs, some green LEDs light up, just indicating how much available battery life is left, or battery is left. So you can see we have two LEDs lit up green. And the inverter is going to be operational right now. And plain and simple, that's it. That's all there is to it to make sure the inverter comes on. There's some other things that the LEDs indicate, faults, LVD, source, load, some different color of LEDs that mean certain things. And if you want that information, feel free to visit our website, www.purkeys.net, and look up Invert under the products. It's the Invert Pure Sine Inverter, and we'll have technical information on the inverter itself, and LED diagnostics and that kind of stuff as well. So again, visit www.purkeys.net to get that information. Thank you.